The file was a heavy, leather-bound dossier kept in the lower drawer of a desk that hadn't been moved in 20 years. Inside was a single surveillance still, grainy but unmistakable, a young woman in medical scrubs, her dark skin luminous under a harsh hospital fluorescent, her natural hair styled in a perfect, rounded afro that seemed to catch the very light the world tried to deny her. Tiana. Kwang-soon had been studying this image for 3 years, tracking her from underfunded clinics to the prestigious placement he had secretly funded. He had moved her into his mother's house like a chess piece positioned for a final, devastating checkmate. At 2 o'clock in the morning, in a study that smelled of expensive tobacco and old secrets, Kwang-soon sat in the dark. He didn't need the light. He had memorized the curve of her jaw and the clinical precision of her hands long before she ever stepped foot on his estate. He was a man of cold, surgical control, carrying a truth that, if exposed to the air of the dining room, would incinerate the very legacy his mother had spent decades fortifying. Now, before we continue, if this story already has your heart in a chokehold, do me a small favor. That subscribe button is free, the bell costs nothing, and dropping your location in the comments takes 2 seconds. You do that for me, and I promise this story is about to take you somewhere you are not ready for. Now, let us keep going. By 8 p.m., the grand dining hall was a battlefield of silk and scent. 10 high society brides, handpicked by the matriarch, sat in a row of shimmering satin and practiced smiles. Their eyes wide with the desperate hunger of social climbing. They had come dressed for a wedding, draped in pearls and status, unaware that they were actually standing in a war zone. Tiana stood in the doorway, a shadow in dark blue scrubs with a stethoscope draped around her neck like a silver weight. To the women at the table, she was a piece of the furniture, an invisible servant holding a medical tray. She believed her presence here was the result of a hard-earned contract and a chance encounter in a rainy park, completely unaware that the man in the charcoal suit at the head of the table had orchestrated every random moment of her life for the last 1,000 days. She was focused only on her charts, while Kwang-soon was focused only on the end of the game. Tiana's day did not begin with the sunrise, but with the rhythmic and mechanical hum of the estate's medical wing at 4 a.m. In the quiet hours before the Kang family donned their masks of prestige, she moved through the corridors with a silent, practiced grace, her flat shoes making no sound on the polished hardwood. To the rest of the household, she was a ghost in navy scrubs, a necessary but overlooked fixture whose primary function was to ensure the heart of the estate kept beating without disturbing the inhabitants. She carried her tray with the same steady hands that had once scrubbed hotel floors in Baltimore, her natural hair pulled into a high puff of coils that seemed to absorb the clinical coldness of the patient wing. Her routine was a symphony of precision and invisibility. She administered medications, adjusted oxygen sensors, and logged vitals into a notebook with a blue cover, and her muscle memory handling the technicalities while her mind processed the weight of her isolation. In the months she had spent within these walls, she had learned that in a house built on ancient power and rigid tradition, being the help meant being a shadow. The high society women who flitted through the main halls looked past her as if she were made of glass, their conversations never pausing as she entered a room to check a pulse. Tiana didn't mind the silence. She used it as armor, a way to protect the hard-won professional identity she had built from the fragments of 17 foster homes. Every afternoon she would sit on a stone bench in the garden during her break, her pharmacology textbook open on her lap. She handled her library card, with its cracked laminate, like a passport to a world where she wasn't just a placement or a case number. She was credits short of a dream she had been chasing since she was a child, holding a one-eared stuffed rabbit, and she refused to let the oppressive wealth of the Kang estate make her forget who she was. She believed she was here by merit, a lucky break from a staffing agency called Meridian that had finally seen her potential. As the sun began to dip, the medical cold of her wing always seemed to sharpen in contrast to the household warmth of the central hall. She would stand in the thresholds, watching the frantic preparations for the matriarch's lavish dinners, seeing the rejected brides arrive in waves of silk and expensive perfume. They were loud, performative, and desperate for the attention of a man who treated the world like a chessboard. while Tiana would simply adjust her stethoscope, check the time on her watch, and return to the shadows of the doorway. She was the woman no one noticed, the one who kept the notebooks and observed the truth, never realizing that the most powerful man in the room had already written her name into the architecture of the house. The silence following Kwang Sun's declaration was not peaceful. It was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the room, leaving the 10 high society women gasping in visible shock. The matriarch was the first to move, her composure shattering like the fine porcelain on the table. She rose from her seat, her ivory blouse shimmering under the chandelier as she turned a look of pure, concentrated venom toward the doorway where Tiana stood. To the matriarch, Tiana was not a person. Thus but a glitch in a perfectly calibrated machine, an outsider whose very presence in the dining hall was an affront to generations of Kang prestige. "Get out," the matriarch hissed, her voice trembling not with fear, but with an ego that had been publicly bruised. She didn't look at her son. She kept her eyes locked on Tiana, who remained frozen with the medical tray in her hands. "You are finished here. Pack your things and leave this estate immediately. I will have your credentials flagged by every agency in the city. You will never step foot in a medical facility again." Tiana felt the familiar coldness of a placement being terminated, the same hollow sensation she had felt in 17 different foster homes when she became too inconvenient to keep. Her grip tightened on the tray, her knuckles turning a deep brown against the silver. She began to step back, her mind already calculating how much bus fare she had left and where she would go when the only world she knew dissolved into nothing. The socialites at the table began to whisper, their shock turning into a cruel, performative amusement as they watched the maid be discarded. "She isn't going anywhere." Kwang Sun's voice was low, but it carried the absolute authority of a man who ran an empire of 14 ports. He didn't move from his position at the head of the table, but the air in the room shifted, turning heavy and dangerous. He finally looked at his mother, his expression a mask of cold, charcoal-gray indifference. The luxury watch on his wrist caught the light as he made a subtle, dismissive gesture toward the line of rejected brides. "You hired her through a shell company to care for this family." "Mother," Kwang Sun said, his eyes flicking back to the reflection of Tiana in the silver wine chiller. "But I am the one who signed the contract. Her placement is not subject to your whims. She stays." "She is a servant, Kwang Sun, a nurse with a cracked library card and no standing," the matriarch erupted, her upright posture vibrating with rage. "You would humiliate these families, humiliate me, for a girl in navy scrubs who was never meant to be more than a shadow?" Kwang Sun stepped toward the doorway, his dominant posture forcing the socialites to pull back in their chairs. He stopped just inches from Tiana, his presence a shield between her and the firing squad at the table. For the first time, Tiana looked up and met his eyes. They weren't the eyes of an employer. They were the intense, calculating eyes of a man who had been watching her through surveillance files for 3 years. "She is the only person in this house who doesn't perform for me," Kwang Sun stated, his voice loud enough for every shocked guest to hear. "The rest of you are architecture. She is the reason this house still stands." He turned his back on the dining hall, his hand hovering near Tiana's arm, not touching, but claiming. The matriarch sank back into her chair, her face a pale mask of silent, vengeful strategy. She was not defeated, she was simply recalculating. Tiana, caught between the furnace of the mother's hate and the cold steel of the son's protection, realized that her invisibility was gone. She was no longer a ghost. She was a target. The morning following the dinner was unnervingly quiet. It was the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift. Tiana had retreated to the East Wing, seeking sanctuary in the rhythmic ticking of medical monitors and the familiar scent of antiseptic. She wanted to believe that Kwang Sun's intervention was merely a display of dominance over his mother, a tactical move in a family war she happened to be standing in the middle of. But that illusion shattered when she walked to the service entrance to begin her afternoon break. Parked on the gravel path, far removed from the staff vehicles, sat a sleek, obsidian black sedan. It was an elite European model, The kind of car that didn't just transport people, but announced their arrival with a low, predatory hum. The keys were held by a silent driver who offered them to Tiana with a slight bow. "A gift from the director," the man said, his voice as neutral as his suit. "For your personal use, Miss Tiana." Tiana didn't take them. She stared at the polished hood, seeing her own reflection in the navy scrubs she still refused to change out of. To anyone else, it was a fortune on wheels. To her, it was a loud, expensive complication. She had spent her life walking blocks in the rain to save bus fare, holding her library card like a passport to a future she would build with her own sweat. A car like this didn't fit into the life of a woman who was 11 credits away from independence. It felt like a gilded leash, a way to make her visible in a way that had nothing to do with her nursing skills. She found Kwang Soon in the glass-walled conservatory, his back to her as he surveyed the estate. He didn't turn when she approached, yet he spoke as if he had been counting her footsteps. "The car is for your safety. My mother's guests are not known for their grace in defeat. I don't need a car to be safe, Kwang Soon. I need to be a nurse," Tiana said, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. She stepped into his line of sight, her stethoscope still draped around her neck, a silver weight that felt more honest than the luxury idling outside. "Why are you doing this? First the dinner, now this. I was placed here to work, not to be a project." Kwang Sun finally looked at her, his intense eyes searching her face with the focus of a man decoding a threat. The charcoal suit he wore made him look like part of the architecture, but the way he watched Tiana was raw and uncalculated. "You think everything in this house is a transaction?" he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "You think I moved you here because I needed a nurse, but the truth is, I've been watching you survive for 3 years, and I'm tired of seeing you do it alone." The air between them went rigid. Tiana felt a fracture open in her understanding of the last 8 months. "You've been watching me?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The random encounter in the park, the staffing agency that seemed too good to be true, the way he always seemed to appear in the hallways at just the right moment. It wasn't luck. It was architecture. Kwang Sun didn't flinch. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching, showing her he had no weapons. "The beginning was a debt I owed your history, but everything since the hallway, that was me." Tiana stepped back. The luxury of the car outside and the intensity of the man before her feeling like a cage. She was a woman who didn't give people what they wanted at her own expense, and she realized the end of her invisibility was the start of a much more dangerous game. The battle for the Kang estate shifted from the dining hall to the digital and social spheres with a speed that felt surgical. Within 48 hours of the obsidian sedan appearing at the service entrance, the invisible nurse became the most scrutinized woman in the city. The rejected brides, led by the woman in the satin-red dress who had gasped the loudest at dinner, did not use weapons. They used whispers and high-priced attorneys. An anonymous tip reached the local medical licensing board, alleging that an unlicensed maid was performing high-level clinical interventions at the estate. The smear campaign was efficient, painting Tiana not as a dedicated nursing student, but as a dangerous interloper playing with medications she wasn't qualified to touch. The pressure culminated at a high society charity gala held at the estate, an event the matriarch refused to cancel despite the looming scandal. Tiana tried to remain in the East Wing, but the matriarch had engineered a moment that required her presence, a public review of the household's medical protocols. As Tiana stepped into the ballroom, her navy scrubs felt like a target against the sea of silk and tailored tuxedos. The air smelled of expensive perfume and sharp desperation. "I hear the help is quite handy with a needle," the woman in the red dress remarked loudly as Tiana passed, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Though I suppose when you're desperate to be noticed, you'll perform any procedure, won't you?" The socialites circled like sharks, their eyes locking onto the stethoscope around Tiana's neck as if it were a stolen piece of jewelry. The matriarch stood at the center of the group, her face a pale mask of calculated concern. "The board has received some very troubling reports, Tiana," she said, her voice dripping with a performative kindness that was more lethal than her earlier rage. "It would be a tragedy if your ambitions resulted in a criminal referral." Tiana felt the floor beneath her begin to crack. Everything she had built, the transcripts with no mark below 92, and the clinical evaluations that called her instinct exceptional, was being reframed as a liability. She looked for a way out, but the brides had formed a wall of satin and judgmental glares. The tension broke when an elderly guest suddenly collapsed near the champagne fountain. The room went into a frantic, useless flutter of silken screams. While the socialites pulled back to protect their dresses, Tiana moved. She dropped to the floor, her flat shoes finding traction on the marble as she began an emergency assessment. "She's not licensed!" someone shrieked. "Don't let her touch him!" Tiana ignored them. Her world narrowed to the man's pulse and the rhythm of his breathing. She was no longer a chess piece or a project. She was a nurse. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Kwang Soon enter the ballroom. He didn't move to help, nor did he call for security. He simply stood at the edge of the circle, his hands in his pockets and his sharp jaw tight, watching her with a terrifyingly calm intensity. He wasn't guarding her, he was witnessing her. Tiana stabilized the guest with the precision of someone who had practiced her statement until her voice did not waver. When the paramedics arrived and took the man's lead, the lead medic looked at Tiana's notes and nodded in grim respect. The smear campaign hadn't ended, but for the first time, the ballroom was silent for a reason other than shock. Tiana stood up, smoothing her scrubs, and realized that while she had saved a life, she had also officially declared war on the architecture that tried to hide her. Gemini said. The adrenaline from the ballroom collapse had barely faded when the weight of the matriarch's earlier words began to settle. Tiana needed to know how deep the roots of this house went, and more importantly, how Kwang Soon had managed to defend her with such surgical precision. While the estate was preoccupied with the cleanup of the gala and the gossip of the emergency, Tiana followed a lead she had found buried in a ledger days prior, a recurring payment to a firm she didn't recognize. It led her to a narrow, unassuming door behind the library, a space that felt colder and more clinical than the rest of the opulent home. Inside, the room was a digital mausoleum. Servers hummed with a low predatory vibration, and a single monitor glowed in the dim light. Tiana's breath hitched as she stepped closer to the desk. There, spread out in a leather-bound folder, was her life. It wasn't just a resume, it was a shadow archive. She saw a grainy surveillance still of herself from 3 years ago, shopping at a corner grocery store in Baltimore, her expression tired and her library card visible in her hand. There were reports on her grocery habits, her bus schedules, and the specific days she sat in the park reading about anatomy. She realized then that her lucky break with the staffing agency hadn't been luck at all. The incorporation records for Meridian staffing were tucked into the back of the file, showing a funding date months before she was even contacted. Every random encounter, every chance meeting with Kwang Soon had been a calculated beat in a long-term operation. He hadn't just watched her, he had engineered the very ground she stood on. So Tiana picked up a photograph of herself at 20, looking into a camera she never knew was there. The invisible nurse hadn't been invisible to everyone. She had been a specimen under a microscope. The pride she had felt in earning her place at the estate curdled into a cold, sharp realization. She hadn't been chosen for her skills alone, but because she was a debt being managed by a man who treated people like assets. She felt the air in the small room turn heavy, the same medical cold that always seemed to follow her. The architecture of her life was a lie. She wasn't an independent woman fighting for her future. She was a chess piece in a game Kwang Soon had been playing for 3 years. The betrayal was silent, permanent, and it left Tiana standing in the dark, wondering if anything she had felt for the man in the charcoal suit was real, or if that too had been part of the design. The chill of the hidden room seemed to seep into Tiana's marrow as she stared at the final document in the folder. It was a weather report from 3 years ago, dated the exact day of a memory she had tucked away as the only beautiful accident of her life. She remembered the rain in that Baltimore park, the way the sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, and the man who had appeared from the mist to offer her an umbrella when her library books were seconds away from being ruined. She had thought it was fate. She had thought for once the universe had looked at her and decided to be kind. But the paper in her hand told a different story. It was a logistics brief. It listed the exact coordinates of the park bench, the timing of her shift change, and the strategic deployment of Subject K. Tiana didn't wait for the shadows of the estate to swallow her. She walked straight into the central study, the folder clutched against her chest like a shield. Kwang Soon was there, standing by the window as he always did, watching the garden where the morning light pulled on stone paths like spilled honey. He didn't turn when she entered, but the tension in his shoulders shifted, a subtle vibration that told her he already knew what she had found. "The rainy park," Tiana said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that cut through the silence of the room. "The umbrella. The way you looked at me like you were seeing something unexpected. It was all a set, wasn't it?" Kwang Soon turned slowly. The charcoal suit made him look like a statue, but his eyes were raw, and the control cracking at the edges. He didn't offer a performance or a lie. He looked at the folder in her hands and then back at her face, his jaw working with a rhythmic intensity. "I memorized your schedule," he admitted, the words landing in the room like lead. "I knew you delivered doses at a certain time. I knew where you walked when the bus fare was too high. I positioned myself in that park at 4:12 because I knew you would be there at 4:17. "Why?" Tiana's voice cracked, a single fracture she couldn't seal. "You turned a debt into something that felt like a beginning. You made me believe that for the first time in my life, someone saw Zara, Tiana, not a case number, not a nurse, but me. You engineered proximity and called it destiny." The beginning was architecture. Kwang Soon stepped toward her, his dominant posture softening into something that looked like a plea. "I was fulfilling a request. I was paying a debt my family owed to a woman who died saving my father. But everything that happened after that hallway, the conversations in the kitchen, the way you refused to let my mother break you, that wasn't in any plan I built. I fell in love with a woman I was supposed to manage, and I was too much of a coward to tell her the floor she was standing on was one I had laid." Tiana looked at him, the man who had caught her falling pill bottle and her falling heart, and realized the betrayal wasn't just in the surveillance, it was in the silence. He had watched her struggle, watched her fight for a life he had already bought and paid for, and let her believe she was doing it alone. She stepped back, said the distance between them feeling like a new, cold measurement. She was done being moved and managed. If there was to be an end to this story, it would be one she wrote herself, on a page he hadn't already numbered. The fallout of the confession left a frost in the hallways that even the estate's heavy heating couldn't touch. Tiana returned to her duties with a surgical focus, her movements mechanical, and her eyes fixed on her charts, refusing to look at the man who had turned her life into a blueprint. She stayed not for Kwang Soon, but for the patient in the bed, the only one in this house whose heart beat without an ulterior motive. But while Tiana retreated into her work, the matriarch was busy inviting the wolves into the garden. The betrayal came in the form of a late-night summit. The matriarch sat in the central parlor, her ivory silks shimmering under the dim light, facing a man Kwang Soon had spent a decade trying to bury, Han Seung, the head of a rival shipping conglomerate. To the matriarch, the invisible nurse was a virus that had compromised her son's judgment, and she was willing to burn a hole in the family empire just to excise her. They didn't speak of murder. People of their stature spoke of repatriation and professional consequences. But the underlying threat was as sharp as a scalpel. By midnight, the estate was breached. It wasn't a violent invasion, but a legal and social siege. Han Seung's private security, authorized by a signature the matriarch had forged or coerced, moved through the corridors with the quiet efficiency of a hostile takeover. They didn't go for the vaults, they went for the east wing. And Kwang Soon found his mother in the study, the same room where he had once held Tiana's surveillance file. She didn't flinch when he slammed the door. "You've made a choice that threatens the succession, Kwang-sun," she said, her voice a calm, terrifying silk. "If you do not sign over the controlling shares of the northern ports to Han Sung tonight, he will ensure your little nurse is taken to a facility where she will await trial for medical fraud. And we both know that in those places, people like her disappear before the first hearing." The choice was a jagged blade held to Kwang-sun's throat. The empire was his identity, the 14 ports his skin and bone. To give them up was to become a ghost in his own city. But as he looked at the monitors, he saw Tiana on a grainy screen, standing her ground against 2 armed men in the hallway, her stethoscope still around her neck, and her chin tilted with that stubborn, beautiful pride. "The architecture of this family was always built on rot, Mother," Kwang-sun said, his voice dropping to a register that made the glass on the desk vibrate. He didn't reach for a pen. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over a command that would liquidate his personal holdings and trigger a scorched earth protocol on the very ports she wanted him to save. "You think the empire is what matters?" He looked at her with a terrifyingly clear-eyed intensity. "The empire is just stone and water. She is the only thing in this house that is real." He turned and ran toward the east wing, leaving the matriarch in the ruins of her own strategy. He arrived just as Han Sung's men reached for Tiana's arm. Kwang-sun didn't use a weapon. He used the sheer, dominant weight of his presence to force the distance. He stood between Tiana and the wolves, his charcoal suit wrinkled and his control, finally, completely gone. "Touch her," he whispered, "and I will burn every ship you own while you're still on board." The standoff in the East Wing was shattered not by a command, but by the violent, sudden sound of a physical collapse. As Han Sung's men recoiled from Kwang-sun's cold fury, the elderly patriarch, Elder Park, slumped forward in his bed, his breathing hitching into a sharp, terrifying rattle. The monitors, which Tiana had watched like a hawk for 8 months, began to wail. It was the medical cold of a crisis, a moment where status, empire, and secret archives meant absolutely nothing. The rival security team hesitated, their training designed for intimidation, not resuscitation. Even the matriarch appearing at the threshold went pale and motionless. The power in the room had shifted. It no longer belonged to the man who owned the ports or the woman who protected the family name. It belonged to the woman in navy scrubs. "Move," Tiana commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an order that cut through the chaos like a scalpel. She didn't look at Kwang-sun, and she certainly didn't look at the armed men. Her world had narrowed to the blue tint on Elder Park's lips and the thinning thread of his pulse. With surgical precision, she began the emergency intervention she had rehearsed every night in her silent room. She adjusted the oxygen flow, her hands steady as she cleared a blocked airway that had sent the old man into respiratory arrest. When Han Sung stepped forward, attempting to regain control of the room, Tiana didn't even look up from the patient. "If you interfere, he dies in 60 seconds, she said, her voice dropping to a register of absolute clinical truth. "And if he dies, your legal takeover becomes a homicide investigation. Back away." Kwang-sun watched her, his own dominant posture yielding to the raw competence of the woman he had tried to manage. He realized then that while he had built the architecture to bring her here, she was the one holding the foundation together. She wasn't a pawn he had moved, she was the power he had lacked. For 7 minutes, Tiana fought for the man who had searched for her for 30 years. She performed the chest compressions and the manual ventilations with a rhythmic, tireless energy, her natural hair damp with sweat and her eyes fixed on the life she refused to let go. The matriarch watched in a stunned, hateful silence as the maid no one noticed performed a miracle that no amount of money could buy. When Elder Park finally gasped, his heart rhythm stabilizing on the monitor, the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a new reality. The paramedics, arriving minutes later, confirmed what everyone in the room already knew. Tiana had performed a surgery of truth. She had proven that her competence was the only thing in the house that wasn't a performance. She stood up, smoothing her navy scrubs, her hands still shaking with the release of adrenaline but her gaze steady. She looked at Kwang Soon, then at the matriarch, and finally at the wolves who had tried to remove her. "I am a nurse," she stated, the words sounding like a final verdict. "And in this room, my word is the only one that matters." The estate exhaled a weary breath as the rival families retreated and the medical crisis settled into a stable, quiet recovery. In the kitchen at 1 a.m., the commercial refrigerator hummed against the steel countertops, the only room where the Kang power dynamics truly dissolved. Tiana sat at the table, her personal notebook open to the page where she had once written a single word, Meridian. Beneath the circled capital letters, she had finally written her own answers. Kwang Soon entered the room, his charcoal jacket gone and his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked like a man who had survived a war only to find he no longer recognized the territory he had fought for. He didn't sit across from her, he sat beside her, their shoulders nearly touching in the silver moonlight. "The matriarch is gone," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "She's moved to the Jeju estate. The board hearing has been settled, and Han Sung has withdrawn his claim. You have your full license, Tiana. It's real. It's yours." Tiana didn't look at him immediately. She traced the edge of her notebook, the same steady hand that had stabilized an IV line, now stabilizing her own future. "You told me once that the beginning was architecture," she said. "That you laid the floor I was standing on before I even knew your name. You spent 3 years watching me, managing me, and moving me like a piece on a board." "I did," Kwang Soon admitted, his jaw tightening as he looked at her, "and it was the greatest mistake of my life to think that love could be engineered." Tiana turned to face him, her dark eyes steady, refusing to let the intensity of his gaze move her. "I am done being a project, Kwang Soon. I spent 30 years being moved from foster home to foster home by people who never asked my name. If I stay in this house, if I stay with you, it won't be because you built a cage and called it a home." She slid the notebook toward him. On the fresh page, she hadn't written a medical report, but a new contract. "I will be your wife," she stated, the words landing with the weight of an absolute truth. "But the architecture of my life belongs to me now. My career, my clinics. The way I move through this world, you will not manage them. You will not fund them through shell companies, and you will not protect me from the consequences of my own choices. If we are to be a family, we will be equal partners, or I will walk out that door tonight and become a ghost you can never find again." Kwang Soon looked at the terms, then back at the woman who had saved his father and dismantled his ego with 12 sentences. He reached for her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, not a claim of possession, but a gesture of surrender. "The beginning was mine," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "But the end belongs to you." Tiana squeezed his hand once, hard, then let go. She stood up, collected her mug and her notebook, and walked toward the doorway. She wasn't running, and she wasn't staying because someone had told her to. She was a woman who had earned her own license, her own name, and her own future. As she looked back at the man in the moonlight, she realized that while the beginning was a lie and the middle was a war, the end was finally hers to write.